I was a seminarian here in Epping 30 years ago. And I remember on the very last night of my pastoral placement here, I'd been here for 6 months, I went and stood on the footpath over Beecroft Road. Back then, it didn't have a cage and a roof and a big sign on it. It was just a footbridge with a handrail. So I remember standing there looking over the edge at all the cars coming up Beecroft Road with the headlights on in the night time. And I was struck suddenly with this realization that every single person in every single car was a person with a story and a life just as unique and precious and interesting as my own. Every single person, their needs, their wants, their desires were just as important as mine. And it was a really significant awareness for me. It wasn't quite on par with Thomas Merton on 4th and Walnut Street, if you know that experience, but it was still a very significant moment where I believe God really showed me something, that I was no more important than anybody else. I had just come from finish off this quite wonderful, affirming time that my pastoral placement in seminary had affirmed for me that yes, I really believe that God is calling me to be a priest, and please God, I think I had the skills to do this one day. It was a wonderful, exciting time. But what God gave me was not a sense of how special I was. It was far the opposite. I am no more special than anybody else. This was really important, to have a sense of decentering myself, and to not be the center of even my own worldview or my own universe. And perhaps this is what Jesus is pointing us towards in the gospel today, where we get this really interesting teaching Jesus gives about when you go to a banquet, don't sit at the highest table, sit yourself at the lowest place. So if you sit at the highest place, somebody may come up and say, please, you don't belong here, you need to move down, you'll be moved to the lowest place, and then you'll be embarrassed. Whereas if you sit at the lowest place, you might be asked to come up higher and you'll be affirmed in front of others. And the teaching is really about humility, and we hear humility in the first reading from Ecclesiasticus as a reference point there. We probably aren't familiar with the idea of these, cultural events where there's tiered seating and there are more important, less important places. Maybe weddings where there's a top table, but maybe we're more familiar with airline seating, where perhaps we had the chance to go on a plane and pick our own seat. And we had decided, we'd walk in, we'd turn left and go to first class or business class. Imagine them being told, no, you don't belong here, and being kicked right down the back to sit in the back row in the middle of the 5 seats with two large people either side of you. By contrast, if you decide to humble yourself and go down to the back of economy class and then being exalted and saying, please, we've given you a free upgrade, please come up to first or business class. That might be a more familiar concept for us. The sense of humility, a sense of where we belong in a community, is something that Jesus actually speaks about quite often. He often talks about those who take pride in themselves, like the Pharisees, who want to be seen to be up the front and be greeted obsequiously in market squares. He always said these people are doing themselves no favours. But those who are humble, those who are like the widow who puts in the small coin in the treasury, those who are like the publican in his parable, who beats his chest and stands at the back of the church and says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. These are people who are shown to be justified in the sight of God. And so we have to then also take, a balance, though, that we are not trying to abase ourselves in such a way to say, oh, we're terrible, because that actually can have negative effects as well, at least if we don't do it right. We are more aware than ever, and probably much more aware than Jesus and his peers were, about the idea of self-esteem, that we need to have a healthy ground on which to base our sense of self. And if we constantly feel ourselves to be inferior, less than others, it may actually be detrimental, and in fact, the effect of that is often not genuine humility. It's often a grasping and a craving to climb some kind of a ladder to get out of the bottom, to get out of the basement and be noticed by others. And so what we actually see is that the act of humility is not a position of weakness, it's a position of strength. If we actually have a true self-esteem, if we know that we are indeed good, we are valued, we are valuable, and that ultimately comes not from anything we do ourselves. It comes only from our worth that God gives us. If we know that we are indeed beautiful and wonderfully made, if we know that we are precious in God's eyes, then we don't need to be seen as precious in other people's eyes. We don't need validation from others because we know who we are. We have a dignity and a status as beloved sons and daughters of God. Then we can quite comfortably go and sit at the back seat of any plane or any banquet or any situation and not feel lessened by it. We won't be grasping. And I guess when thinking back to my experience of 30 years ago, it was in a time of great confidence, having had a successful pastoral placement, that God was able to then show me, you are no more special. You don't need to be affirmed or told how good you are, because you are good in my sight, in my eyes. And that's, I think, the way we might try and view this, to try to find our worth, not in what other people think of us or our achievements, or even less our possessions. Our worth is from God. God gives us an innate dignity which He gives to each and every other human person. And so we are no better, but neither are we any worse than anyone else. We simply are loved by God, and knowing that, we can be in communion and community with all people.